When a black woman boarded her private jet, she expected a smooth flight. What she didn't expect was to face blatant prejudice from the very crew she trusted. But when the calm and composed woman revealed her true identity as the owner of the airline, everything changed. The private jet gleamed in the late afternoon sun, its polished exterior reflecting the vibrant hues of the sky. Parked on the tarmac of New Horizon International Airport, the aircraft stood as a symbol of opulence and exclusivity. Inside, the cabin radiated luxury, plush leather seats in muted tones, gold accents lining the walls, and soft ambient lighting creating a serene atmosphere. A faint melody of classical music played in the background, adding to the refined air. Passengers began boarding in a steady stream, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Most carried themselves with the nonchalance of seasoned travelers, accustomed to the extravagance this airline promised. Rolling suitcases glided smoothly behind them, designer labels gleaming under the overhead lights. Among the boarding passengers was Amara Johnson, a poised woman in her late 30s. Dressed in a tailored gray blazer and matching slacks, she exuded an understated elegance. Her natural curls framed her face, and her calm demeanor hinted at a quiet confidence. Amara's leather satchel hung effortlessly from her shoulder as she moved toward the jet's entrance. Amara was no ordinary traveler. As the CEO of a rapidly growing tech empire, she was a woman accustomed to navigating spaces where she was often underestimated. Today, however, she preferred to keep her identity low profile, blending in among the other passengers. This flight wasn't just a routine trip. It was an essential journey tied to an acquisition deal that would cement her company's dominance in the industry. Standing at the entrance to the cabin was Clara Davis, the lead flight attendant. In her early 40s, Clara was impeccably dressed in the airline's crisp navy uniform, her blonde hair twisted into a neat bun. Her sharp features and practiced smile gave her an air of control, but her demeanor often betrayed a tendency toward judgment. Clara prided herself on maintaining order and catering to what she deemed the right kind of clientele. Appearances to Clara meant everything. As the Carters, a distinguished elderly couple who frequently traveled with this airline, approached, Clara's smile widened into a warm, welcoming beam. Evelyn and Thomas Carter, both in their late 60s, exuded an air of affluence and familiarity. Evelyn clutched a delicate knitting bag while Thomas carried a neatly folded newspaper under one arm. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, Clara greeted them warmly, her tone practically dripping with honey. "It's always a pleasure to have you aboard. Can I get you anything before we take off?" Evelyn returned the smile. "Oh, we're quite fine, dear," she said, patting Clara's arm lightly. Thomas nodded in agreement, his expression one of contented ease. Clara escorted them to their usual seats near the front of the cabin, ensuring their comfort with meticulous care. As she turned back to the entrance, her expression shifted subtly. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a cooler, almost clinical detachment as Amara stepped up the stairs. "Welcome aboard," Clara said curtly, her tone void of the friendliness she had just displayed. Amara's eyes flicked to Clara, noting the stark change in tone. Her expression remained calm, but there was a glimmer of awareness in her gaze. "Thank you," she said simply, stepping past Clara and toward her assigned seat. Amara settled into her seat near the window, placing her satchel neatly beneath it. She glanced briefly around the cabin, her eyes scanning the other passengers. Across the aisle, a young businessman, Daniel Miller, was already engrossed in his tablet, occasionally sipping from a bottle of water. His tailored suit and polished demeanor suggested a man climbing the corporate ladder. A few seats ahead, Evelyn had begun knitting, her needles clicking softly as she worked. Thomas was buried in his newspaper, occasionally adjusting his reading glasses. The atmosphere was tranquil, with most passengers either scrolling through their phones or quietly conversing with their companions. Clara moved through the aisle with practiced precision, ensuring that each passenger had what they needed. When she reached Daniel, her tone softened once again. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice full of practiced charm. Daniel looked up briefly, smiling politely. "No, thank you. I'm all set." Clara nodded and moved on, her demeanor once again shifting as she approached Amara. She paused briefly, her eyes flicking toward the satchel under Amara's seat. "Is that your bag?" Clara asked, her tone sharper now. "Yes," Amara replied, her voice calm. "It's stored properly." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just make sure it doesn't block the aisle," she said before moving on, without waiting for a response. Amara leaned back slightly, her expression neutral, though she couldn't ignore the tension Clara seemed to direct her way. She opened a book, allowing herself to focus on the words rather than the undercurrent of discomfort brewing in the cabin. At the rear of the cabin, Mia Taylor, the junior flight attendant, was carefully organizing trays of drinks. In her mid-20s, Mia was new to the airline and eager to make a good impression. She observed Clara's interactions from a distance, her brow furrowing slightly as she noticed the shift in tone between passengers. Mia hesitated, debating whether to say something, but the fear of overstepping kept her silent. As the jet prepared for takeoff, the tension was subtle but palpable. Amara remained composed, her focus shifting between the book in her hands and the faint hum of activity around her. Clara's gaze lingered on her more than once, her expression unreadable but tinged with an unspoken judgment. The hum of the engines grew louder, signaling the impending ascent. Passengers settled into their seats, fastening seatbelts and adjusting their belongings. As the jet began its smooth climb into the sky, Amara looked out the window, watching the city shrink beneath her. She closed her book, her thoughts momentarily drifting to the upcoming business deal. Little did she know, this flight would soon test her patience, her strength, and her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. As the private jet settled into cruising altitude, the passengers eased into their routines. Some leaned back into their seats with books or tablets, while others engaged in soft conversation. The hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop, lulling the cabin into a calm rhythm. Amara Johnson, seated near the middle of the cabin, took a sip from her water bottle, her gaze occasionally drifting out the window to the endless sky. Her demeanor was serene, exuding quiet confidence, but she was acutely aware of the subtle tension simmering just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Clara Davis strode purposefully down the aisle, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin like a hawk surveying its domain. She moved with the efficiency of someone who thrived on control, ensuring that the image of perfection she prided herself on was maintained. Yet her gaze frequently flicked back toward Amara, her expression unreadable but laced with unspoken judgment. When Clara reached Evelyn Carter, her entire demeanor shifted. "Mrs. Carter," she said warmly, her voice practically glowing with politeness, "is there anything else I can get you? Perhaps another glass of champagne?" Evelyn looked up from her knitting, smiling kindly. "Oh no, dear, I'm perfectly fine," she said, gesturing to her half-full flute of champagne. "But thank you for asking." "Of course," Clara replied, her smile lingering as she moved to the next row. Her warmth faded as she approached Amara's seat. She paused just beside her, the edges of her mouth tightening into a thin line. "Excuse me, Ma'am," Clara said, her tone noticeably cooler. "I believe this section is reserved for elite passengers. Are you sure this is your assigned seat?" Amara looked up from her book, her expression calm but alert. "Yes, this is my assigned seat," she said, her voice steady. "You can double-check the manifest if there's any confusion." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, her condescending smile firmly in place. "That won't be necessary," she replied curtly. "I know the seating arrangements quite well." Amara raised an eyebrow, a faint smile touching her lips. "Then there shouldn't be a problem," she said simply, returning her gaze to her book. Clara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, choosing instead to move down the aisle. Her sharp heels clicked against the carpet as she made her way to the galley. At the rear of the plane, Mia Taylor, the junior flight attendant, stood nervously near the beverage cart. She had been observing Clara's interactions with Amara from a distance, her unease growing with each passing moment. Mia wasn't new to witnessing Clara's selective treatment of passengers, but something about this situation felt particularly troubling. Mia glanced at the passenger manifest clipped to the wall and hesitated. Should she intervene? Should she at least check Amara's seat assignment as a precaution? The thought of challenging Clara's authority made her stomach churn. But the tension in the cabin was impossible to ignore. Her thoughts were interrupted by Clara entering the galley, her movements brisk and purposeful. "Mia," Clara said sharply, snapping her fingers to get the younger woman's attention, "I need you to prepare another round of drinks for the Carters. And for heaven's sake, keep an eye on the passengers. I don't want any disturbances." Mia nodded quickly, her hands fumbling with the glasses. "Yes, of course," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara narrowed her eyes, clearly unsatisfied with Mia's response, but she said nothing further. With a flick of her wrist, she turned and exited the galley, heading back toward the main cabin. Clara, visibly irritated, returned to the main cabin, carrying a tray of drinks for other passengers. Her polished heels clicked sharply against the carpet as she approached Amara's row. Her frustration was palpable, and her movements seemed deliberately brisk, as though she wanted everyone to notice her authority. Amara, sitting calmly, shifted slightly in her seat to adjust her blazer. The movement was subtle, unassuming, but Clara zeroed in on it immediately. She altered her path unnecessarily close to Amara's seat, and that was when it happened. Clara's foot clipped Amara's outstretched leg, and the tray she was carrying tilted dangerously. A glass of water toppled over, spilling onto Amara's tailored blazer and pooling on her lap. Gasps rippled through the nearby passengers, their shock evident as the pristine calm of the cabin shattered. "Oh," Clara exclaimed, though her tone lacked sincerity. She placed the tray down and straightened quickly, brushing at her uniform as though she were the victim. "You should really be more mindful of your space," she added, her voice laced with condescension. Amara froze, staring down at the water spreading across her clothing. Her blazer, a custom piece designed for her upcoming meeting, was soaked. Slowly she looked up at Clara, her calm expression replaced with one of sharp irritation. "Excuse me?" Amara said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the nearby passengers. She didn't raise her voice, but the steel in her tone silenced those who had been whispering. "You spilled water on me, and now you're blaming me." Clara stiffened, her confidence faltering for a moment. "I didn't mean—" "No," Amara interrupted, leaning slightly forward. "You didn't mean to, but you did. And instead of apologizing, you're accusing me of being careless." Her voice, though controlled, carried a quiet intensity that left no room for argument. Passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort with Clara's behavior growing. Daniel Miller, sitting across the aisle, frowned openly. "That wasn't her fault," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You walked right into her space." Clara turned toward Daniel, her expression tightening. "I don't need your commentary, sir," she said sharply, but her tone lacked the authority it had moments ago. Amara, now dabbing at the water with a napkin, met Clara's gaze with unwavering strength. "I expect better from a professional," she said. "And I expect an apology." Clara hesitated, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but her pride held her back. Instead, she grabbed the now empty tray and muttered, "I'll bring a towel," before retreating toward the galley. As she disappeared, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and many were visibly unsettled by what they had just witnessed. Amara leaned back in her seat, her composure returning as she continued to blot her blazer. "Ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Back in her seat, Amara noticed the subtle glances and whispers from some of the other passengers. Daniel Miller, seated across the aisle, had been observing the interactions with growing concern. He leaned slightly toward Amara, lowering his voice so as not to draw attention. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone polite but genuinely concerned. Amara looked up from her book, her expression softening. "I'm fine," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you for asking." Daniel hesitated, clearly weighing whether to say more. "If you need anything," he said finally, "just let me know." Amara nodded, appreciating the gesture. "I will," she replied, offering a small, reassuring smile. The cabin's tranquil atmosphere was shattered moments later when Clara returned, her tone noticeably louder as she addressed Amara once again. "Mom," Clara began, her voice carrying across the cabin, "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat. This section is strictly for our most exclusive clientele." Amara looked up, her calm demeanor unshaken. "As I've already mentioned," she said, her tone measured, "this is my assigned seat." Clara crossed her arms, her lips pressing into a tight line. "I don't believe that's correct," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Passengers in this section are personally verified before boarding." Amara's gaze held Clara's, steady and unyielding. "Then perhaps you should verify again," she suggested. At that moment, the cabin fell into an uneasy silence. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Evelyn Carter glanced toward her husband, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Daniel leaned back in his seat, his jaw tightening as he watched the exchange. Clara's patience snapped. "If you don't move to the back of the plane," she said, her voice sharp and loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'll have no choice but to call security." The tension in the cabin was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Amara tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but resolute. "Call whoever you need to," she said simply, her voice steady. "I'm not moving." Clara's face flushed with irritation, her composure slipping further with each passing second. Behind her, Mia watched the scene unfold, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the beverage cart. She wanted to intervene, to suggest checking the manifest as Amara had repeatedly requested, but the fear of Clara's wrath kept her rooted in place. Daniel, unable to remain silent any longer, leaned forward. "Perhaps it's worth checking the manifest," he said, his tone firm but polite. "It would resolve this quickly." Clara shot him a withering glare. "I don't need advice from a passenger," she snapped. "This is under control." "Doesn't look that way from where I'm sitting," Daniel muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Clara ignored him, turning back to Amara with a final glare. "You've been warned," she said, her voice low but seething with anger. "Don't say I didn't give you a chance." Amara didn't flinch, her calm demeanor unwavering. "You're making a mistake," she said softly, her words hanging in the air like a quiet storm brewing. As Clara stormed away toward the cockpit, the cabin buzzed with murmurs and whispers. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how the situation would unfold. Amara remained seated, her gaze steady as she looked out the window, the faintest trace of a knowing smile playing on her lips. The cabin was tense, a charged silence falling over the passengers after Clara's sharp words to Amara. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, stealing glances toward Amara, while others whispered quietly, their murmurs barely audible over the hum of the engines. Amara remained composed, her posture straight and her gaze fixed out the window. She wasn't just ignoring the whispers, she was assessing the situation, carefully measuring her next move. Her mind worked quickly, balancing the frustration of the moment with the need to maintain her poise. Clara, meanwhile, was pacing near the galley, her movements sharp and agitated. Her face was flushed, and her hands were clenched tightly around a clipboard. Every so often, she shot a glare toward Amara, her frustration evident. To her, this was a matter of control, and she wasn't about to let someone like Amara challenge her authority. Mia Taylor, standing a few feet away from Clara, nervously glanced toward the cockpit. She had been working for the airline long enough to know when a situation was spiraling out of control. Her heart raced as she debated whether to intervene, her fingers twitching as she clutched a stack of passenger menus. Summoning a burst of courage, Mia spoke up, her voice soft but steady. "Clara, maybe we should just double-check the manifest. It wouldn't hurt to confirm her seat." Clara rounded on Mia, her eyes narrowing. "Stay out of it, Mia," she snapped, her voice sharp. "I've been doing this job for years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't." Mia flinched, her cheeks flushing. She nodded quickly, retreating a step, but the unease in her expression lingered. Her gaze flicked toward Amara, who had glanced briefly in her direction before returning her focus to the window. At that moment, Daniel Miller, seated across the aisle, leaned toward Amara. His voice was low, but there was a firmness in his tone. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. If there's anything I can do—" Amara offered him a small smile, her calm demeanor unbroken. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I've got this." Daniel hesitated for a moment, clearly torn. Finally, he nodded, sitting back in his seat, though his expression remained one of quiet indignation. As Clara moved back into the cabin, her irritation had only grown. She stopped in front of Amara's seat, crossing her arms. Her voice was deliberately loud, ensuring the other passengers could hear. "Ma'am," she began, her tone laced with condescension, "I'm giving you one last chance to move. If you refuse, I'll have to call security when we land, and you'll be escorted off the plane." Amara set her book down and slowly turned to face Clara. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried an undeniable strength. "I've already told you," she said evenly. "This is my assigned seat. I'm not moving." Clara's jaw tightened, her composure slipping further. "You're disrupting the flight," she snapped, gesturing to the other passengers. "Look around. People are uncomfortable because of you." From across the aisle, Daniel spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. Actually, he said, the only person making anyone uncomfortable is you. The cabin fell into stunned silence. Several passengers nodded in quiet agreement, their glances shifting between Clara and Amara. Clara turned to Daniel, her face flushing with anger. "This is none of your business," she said sharply. Daniel held her gaze, unflinching. "You're making it everyone's business," he replied. "All she's done is sit in her seat. You're the one escalating this." Before Clara could respond, the cockpit door opened, and the pilot stepped into the cabin. Captain Robert Hayes, a seasoned aviator in his late 40s, exuded authority and calm as he approached the group. His sharp gaze took in the scene quickly, lingering on Clara for a moment before settling on Amara. "Is there a problem here?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice measured but firm. Clara stepped forward immediately, her voice tinged with indignation. "Yes, Captain," she said. "This passenger refuses to move to the appropriate section, and she's disrupting the flight." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly, and he glanced toward Amara. "Ma, may I ask your name?" he said, his tone polite but authoritative. Amara met his gaze, her expression steady. "Amara Johnson," she replied simply. Captain Hayes froze for a fraction of a second, the recognition flickering in his eyes. He straightened immediately, his demeanor shifting. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice now carrying a note of deference, "I wasn't aware you were on this flight. My apologies for the inconvenience." The passengers murmured in confusion, their whispers filling the cabin. Clara's face drained of color as she stared at the captain, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. "Wait," Clara stammered, her voice faltering. You know her." Captain Hayes turned to Clara, his expression now cold. "Miss Johnson is not just a passenger," he said. "She's the owner of this aircraft and the airline." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The realization struck like a thunderclap, and every eye turned toward Amara. Evelyn Carter clutched her knitting needles, her face a mix of shock and embarrassment. Daniel's lips curved into a knowing smile, while Mia's eyes widened in disbelief. Clara took a step back, her confidence crumbling. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's the problem," Amara said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of authority. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. "You didn't take the time to find out. You made assumptions, and now you're facing the consequences." The cabin was silent, the tension thick as Clara struggled to respond. Captain Hayes cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Clara," he said firmly, "please return to the galley. I'll handle this from here." Clara hesitated, her eyes darting between the captain and Amara. Finally, she nodded stiffly and turned, retreating down the aisle with her head lowered. As the door to the galley closed behind Clara, Amara turned to address the passengers. "I apologize for the disruption," she said, her tone calm but commanding. "This is not the standard of service I expect on my planes. I appreciate your patience, and I assure you this will be addressed." The passengers broke into quiet applause, their relief and admiration evident. Daniel leaned across the aisle, his smile widening. "Well handled," he said quietly. Amara inclined her head in acknowledgement, her composure unwavering. The storm had passed, but the ripple effects of this moment were just beginning to take shape. As she sat back down, the pilot returned to the cockpit, and the cabin settled once more. As the private jet cruised through the skies, the atmosphere inside the cabin was starkly different from just moments ago. The tension that had suffused the air seemed to have lifted, replaced by a quiet buzz of conversation and subdued glances toward Amara Johnson. The weight of her identity, owner of the plane, and the airline hung heavily in the minds of every passenger, particularly those who had witnessed the earlier confrontation. Amara sat calmly in her seat, her posture relaxed but commanding. She opened her book again, but her focus was elsewhere. Her demeanor suggested composure, but her mind churned with thoughts of what had just unfolded. It wasn't the first time she had encountered bias and assumptions based on her appearance, but it was another reminder of why her leadership was necessary in industries still plagued by such issues. At the back of the plane, Clara Davis stood in the galley, gripping the counter tightly as she stared blankly at her reflection in the stainless steel paneling. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly. She replayed the events over and over in her mind, the weight of her actions sinking in with each passing second. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by Mia Taylor, who hesitated near the doorway, her expression a mix of discomfort and determination. "Clara," Mia said softly, her voice almost timid. I think you should have double-checked the manifest. It could have avoided all of this." Clara turned sharply, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "And what good is saying that now?" she snapped, her voice strained. "You think I don't already know I messed up?" Mia flinched but held her ground. "I'm just saying," she replied, her voice growing steadier, "that maybe it's not too late to apologize." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She looked away, her jaw tightening. The realization that she had not only humiliated herself but also damaged her professional reputation was overwhelming. Back in the cabin, Captain Robert Hayes reemerged, walking down the aisle with a purposeful stride. He approached Amara's seat and stopped beside her, his demeanor professional but apologetic. "Miss Johnson," he began, inclining his head respectfully, "I want to personally apologize for what happened earlier. This kind of behavior is unacceptable and doesn't reflect the values of our airline." Amara looked up, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Captain Hayes," she said. "I appreciate your acknowledgement, but this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to experience what I did." The captain nodded, his respect for Amara evident. "I assure you steps will be taken to address this immediately. Clara's actions will be reviewed and appropriate measures will be enforced." Amara's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's all I ask," she said. Meanwhile, passengers continued to exchange quiet comments about the revelation. Evelyn Carter, who had been silently knitting during the earlier exchange, leaned over to her husband, her voice low. "Can you believe it?" Evelyn whispered. "She owns the entire airline." Thomas lowered his newspaper, his expression thoughtful. "It's a reminder," he said, "that you never really know who someone is. It pays to treat everyone with respect." Evelyn nodded, her gaze drifting toward Amara with a newfound admiration. Across the aisle, Daniel Miller tapped his fingers against the armrest, his thoughts clearly focused on what had just transpired. He glanced at Amara again, his respect for her evident. Moments later, Captain Hayes approached Clara in the galley. His expression was stern, but his tone remained even. "Clara," he said, "I need to speak with you." Clara straightened, her hands clasping nervously in front of her. "Yes, Captain." "You're being removed from this flight once we land," he said bluntly. "This situation has gone too far. Your behavior today has violated the standards we hold for all crew members." Clara's face turned ashen. "Captain, please," she began, her voice trembling. "I can explain." "There's no excuse." Captain Hayes interrupted, his tone firm. "You were given multiple opportunities to handle this professionally, and you chose to escalate the situation instead." Clara's shoulders sagged, and she swallowed hard. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. As the plane began its descent, Amara prepared herself for the landing. She adjusted her blazer and neatly packed away her book, her movements deliberate and composed. When the jet touched down smoothly on the runway, a sleek black SUV was already waiting on the tarmac. Passengers watched in quiet curiosity as two sharply dressed assistants exited the vehicle and ascended the plane's steps. They moved with purpose, their expressions calm but professional. "Ms. Johnson," one of them said warmly as they approached her seat. "We've prepared everything for your arrival. Do you need anything before we proceed?" Amara stood gracefully, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the cabin. She turned to address the passengers, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you all for your patience during today's flight," she began. "I deeply regret the disruption and assure you that steps are being taken to prevent anything like this from happening again. Respect is not negotiable, it's a standard we must uphold for everyone." The cabin erupted into soft applause. Evelyn Carter set aside her knitting to clap politely, while Daniel gave Amara an approving nod. Even Mia, standing quietly at the back, felt a swell of admiration for the woman who had handled the situation with such grace. As Amara descended the steps of the plane and climbed into the waiting SUV, she glanced back briefly. Her eyes lingered on Mia, who stood by the entrance, watching with a mix of awe and gratitude. Amara offered her a small smile, a silent acknowledgement of her potential. The SUV pulled away, and the plane's engines began to quiet. Inside the cabin, passengers continued to process what they had witnessed, many of them silently reflecting on the lessons they had learned. A ripple effect in the days following the flight. The story of Amara Johnson's calm defiance and powerful stance went viral. Social media buzzed with conversations about respect, bias, and leadership. Hashtags like respect above all and leadership with grace trended, inspiring people around the world. Amara, appearing on a televised interview, addressed the incident directly. Leadership isn't just about making decisions, she said. It's about setting an example, showing that respect is a right, not a privilege. And it's about using your voice to create change, not just for yourself but for everyone. Her words resonated far beyond the confines of the flight, sparking conversations in workplaces, schools, and homes. The airline implemented new training programs focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, ensuring that every passenger would be treated with dignity. For Amara, the flight was more than just another journey. It was a reminder of her mission, to lead with integrity and inspire others to do the same. As she moved forward, she carried the quiet triumph of turning a moment of injustice into a catalyst for lasting change. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.